No one expected Sophie to leave first, yet when the family meeting behind closed palace doors ended, the Duchess reportedly rose without a word, gathered her papers, and walked out. Witnesses would later describe the atmosphere as unusually cold. At the center of the conversation was a painful question few imagined had ever reached the table. What future, if any, would her children have inside the monarchy? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What made the moment so striking was not the drama of the exit, but the silence that came before it. According to various royal commentators and long-running discussions surrounding the monarchy's future, this was not believed to be an ordinary family gathering. Reports and interpretations suggest the meeting took place during a period when conversations inside royal circles had increasingly shifted away from expansion and toward preservation. The institutio, already adapting to years of transition, appeared more focused than ever on defining who would carry visible responsibilities into the next era and who would not. Sophie reportedly arrived expecting conversation, deliberation, perhaps even reassurance. For years, she had occupied a unique position inside the royal structure, close enough to understand its demands, distant enough to protect her family from its intensity. Unlike figures who had embraced public spectacle, Sophie's reputation had often been shaped by consistency, restraint, and loyalty. Those who follow royal developments have frequently described her as someone who understood that influence inside the monarchy was rarely loud. It was earned quietly. That may be why what unfolded reportedly felt so unexpected. Interpretations of the discussion suggest attention gradually turned toward a question that had remained largely untouched in public conversation: the long-term place of her children in a monarchy increasingly Maybade is streamlined, focused, and selective, not removed from the family, not rejected, but potentially positioned outside the core structure many had once assumed would remain open to future generations. No official account has ever framed events in those terms. Yet observers and commentators have long pointed to a broader shift in philosophy surrounding royal visibility. A monarchy with fewer public roles, fewer working figures, fewer expectations placed on younger members unless absolutely necessary. And somewhere inside that larger institutional logic was a deeply personal reality. Because strategy looks different when discussed in policy language. It feels different when attached to your own children. Those familiar with royal transitions often note that these decisions are rarely presented as emotional. They arrive wrapped in practical language modernization, efficiency, sustainability, public expectations, words that sound measured, words that make difficult choices appear inevitable. But reports suggest something in the room changed when abstract planning became personal. What had perhaps once been understood as flexibility suddenly appeared more permanent. Questions reportedly emerged, not dramatic ones, not confrontational ones, but quieter and harder questions. If opportunities narrowed now, would they ever reopen? If visibility disappeared early, would identity inside the institution slowly disappear with it? Observers later pointed to unusual details: the length of pauses, the restrained tone, the absence of visible disagreement, not because anyone was said to be arguing, but because the atmosphere reportedly carried something more uncomfortable than conflict: acceptance. And that possibility may have been harder to absorb than opposition. Sophie, according to interpretations circulating afterward, remained composed throughout most of the discussion. No raised voice, no public emotion, just careful listening, careful consideration, the kind of restraint oil life rewards, until eventually she stood. No dramatic declaration followed. No statement emerged. Reports suggest she simply collected what she had brought, acknowledged the room, and left before the conversations fully ended. That single decision instantly created questions. Was she disappointed? Was she protecting her children? Or had she understood something in that room before everyone else did? Because once she walked out, attention shifted. Not toward what had been decided, but toward what had been left unsaid. And if those interpretations were even partially true, then this moment was never really about titles or appearances at all. But this wasn't a sudden disagreement, it was the culmination of years of quiet sacrifice. For years, Sophie never demanded center stage. Reports often framed her as dependable, disciplined, and content to serve without spectacle, which is why what happened next reportedly struck palace insiders so deeply. Long before questions about roles, appellity, or the future of the monarchy began surfacing, Sophie had built something far quieter and perhaps far more unusual inside royal life. She built trust, not through headlines, not through carefully staged moments, but through consistency, through showing up, through understanding that within institutions shaped by centuries of expectation, endurance often mattered more than attention. That reputation did not appear overnight. Over the years, commentators repeatedly described her as one of the monarchy's steady hands, a figure who rarely competed for influence and rarely inserted herself into battles that did not belong to her. While others became symbols of transformation, conflict, or reinvention, Sophie's public identity developed differently. Reports often suggested she embraced the less glamorous side of royal life. Duty without performance, responsibility without applause. And perhaps because of that, assumptions quietly formed around her family. There had long been an underbelly promised but often interpreted that her children occupied a rare position, close enough to the institution to belong to it, far enough from its center to still possess freedom. To many observers, that arrangement looked almost ideal, a life connected to tradition without becoming consumed by it. Those assumptions shaped expectations. For years, royal watchers speculated that if circumstances changed in the future, doors could remain open. If her children wished to step closer to public roles one day, perhaps they could. If the monarchy evolved again, perhaps opportunities would emerge naturally. Nothing immediate, nothing guaranteed, just possibility. And possibility for a long time felt enough. That belief may explain why the conversations described in the previous meeting reportedly carried more emotional weight than outsiders initially realized. Because Sophie was not believed to be protecting ambition. She was protecting options. There is a difference. Regarding various interpretations circulating among royal commentators, the concern was never about status or titles alone. It was about preserving the right to choose later. To allow her children to grow outside intense scrutiny while still knowing that service, if desired, remained within reach. But institutions change, and sometimes they change quietly enough that no one notices until the consequences become personal. As discussions surrounding a more focused monarchy gained momentum over recent years, language reportedly shifted. The conversation became less about future flexibility and more about present structure. Less about possibility and more about practicality. Observers began noticing subtle changes in how the future was described. Fewer references to expansion, more emphasis on efficiency, less discussion of future generations, more attention on immediate continuity. At first, these shifts seemed administrative, technical, easy to overlook, until people began asking who this decisions would eventually affect. And according to interpretations of that private discussion, Sophie may have realized something before others were prepared to say it aloud. That choices once delayed could now be narrowing. That what had once felt temporary might become permanent. That raising children outside the spotlight had protected them but may also have placed them outside the path people quietly assumed would always remain available, which created a painful contrast. Years of restraint, years of service, years of asking for very little, and now uncertainty. Not rejection, not exclusion. Something more difficult to define and perhaps harder to challenge. Because if nobody explicitly closes the door, how do you argue when it slowly stops opening? And that question reportedly lingered in the room longer than anyone expected. Then came the proposal that reportedly changed the tone of the room. What was presented as strategy may have felt to some like closure. According to Roy, now, commentary and interpretations, discussions increasingly centered not on expansion but reduction. And that was where the atmosphere reportedly changed. Because until that point, difficult conversations could still be framed as temporary adjustments. Timelines could shift, expectations could evolve, decisions could remain open. But according to interpretations that emerged afterward, the discussion now moved into territory that felt less flexible and far more permanent. Not who would serve today, who would serve at all. For years, the idea of a more streamlined monarchy had circulated through royal analysis and public commentary. Supporters described it as modern, focused, sustainable, a structure built for changing expectations and growing scrutiny. Fewer public figures, clearer responsibilities, less overlap. In theory, it sounded practical. But institutions often reveal their true cost only when principles become people. And according to reports and commentary surrounding internal thinking, the conversation had increasingly shifted from broad ideas into difficult arithmetic. How many active roles should exist? How many public-facing members could be justified? How many generations could realistically remain visible without creating confusion around purpose and expense? These questions may have sounded administrative, until names entered the conversation. That, according to various interpretations, was the moment the emotional gravity became impossible to ignore, because reducing visibility is not the same as reducing expectations. Inside royal life, titles carry symbolism, responsibilities carry meaning, but neither automatically guarantees the other. And for younger generations raised close enough to understand duty but far enough to avoid becoming defined by it, that distinction can become deeply complicated. Observers have long noted that royal identity exists in strange territory, too public to disappear completely, too private to fully belong to the public, existing between recognition and restraint, which meant one question reportedly lingered beneath the discussion. If fewer active roles exist in the future, what happens to those standing just outside the line? Commentators interpreted this not as exclusion but as repositioning. Yet emotionally, the difference may not always feel significant, because being told the future is changing sounds very different from realizing the future may no longer include choices once assumed available. Reports suggest conversations turn toward responsibility over status, visibility over title, service over symbolism. The implication was subtle but powerful. Being royal and being active within the monarchy might no longer travel together. And if that distinction became policy rather than possibility, entire expectations could shift quietly across generations. That realization reportedly hit harder than anticipated, not because anyone was demanding privilege, but because years had been spent balance, raise children normally, protect them from unnecessary exposure, keep opportunities open, trust that if service became meaningful later, the institution would still have space. According to interpretations of that meeting, Sophie may have begun recognizing a different reality. What if protecting distance had also created distance? What if the careful path once seen as wise now meant future roles would become increasingly unlikely? There are moments when difficult decisions arrive loudly, and there are moments when they arrive disguised as logic. Reports suggest this felt like the second kind. No confrontation, no declarations, just measured language carrying consequences much larger than the words themselves. And perhaps that was what made the room feel colder afterward, because nobody was being asked to give something up. Yet everyone seemed to understand something was quietly being taken away. Not titles, not belonging, something harder to define, expectation. And once expectation changes, identity often follows behind it, which may explain why, according to interpretations afterward, Sophie reportedly stopped hearing strategy and started hearing meaning. Yet the hardest part wasn't the policy, it was what it seemed to say. Royal duty is often described as sacrifice, but sacrifice becomes harder when it no longer concerns titles and begins touching family. By that point, according to interpretations surrounding the meeting, the conversation had already moved beyond structure, beyond public expectations, and beyond institutional language. What remained was something quieter and infinitely more difficult to navigate. The point where service to the crown and responsibility to family no longer appeared to move in the same direction. For years, Sophie had seemed to embody a balance many believed was almost impossible to achieve. She remained committed to royal life without allowing it to consume everything around her. She served without appearing consumed by status. She protected privacy without rejecting responsibility. To many observers, that balance became part of her identity, a way of proving that loyalty and normalcy could exist together. And perhaps nowhere was that balance more carefully maintained than in the way her children were raised. Reports and long-standing commentary often noted that they had largely grown outside the relentless pressure associated with central royal visibility. There was no sense of urgency, no public expectation that every appearance become preparation. Instead, there appeared to be space to mature, space to choose, space to exist before deciding whether public duty belonged in their future. That arrangement had always carried an unspoken understanding. Not that a path was guaranteed, only that it remained possible, which may explain why interpretations of that private discussion suggested the emotional weight landed differently for Sophie than it did for others in the room. Because narrowing I see opportunities is one thing. Realizing your children may never even face the decision themselves is something else entirely. According to commentary and speculation that followed, the conversation reportedly emphasized practicality. The institution needed clarity. Public trust mattered. Visible roles required definition. These arguments were not framed as personal. They rarely are. But difficult institutional decisions often become personal long before anyone admits it. And somewhere during those exchanges, a quieter question may have emerged beneath everything else. If service becomes increasingly limited, what does belonging look like? For children raised close to an institution but not fully inside its center, identity can become complicated, too connected to be ordinary, too distant to carry purpose automatically. Observers have long suggested that this middle space can create unusual expectations. You are told there is freedom, yet everyone assumes there is possibility. You are encouraged to live normally, yet history follows closely behind. And if the institution begins changing while you are still growing into your place inside it, where exactly does that leave you? Reports suggest nobody in the room was protesting. That may have been the hardest part. Royal culture has long been described as one that values acceptance over resistance, composure over reaction, understanding over confrontation. You listen, you absorb, you adjust. Emotion becomes private, duty becomes public, and perhaps Sophie understood those rules better than most, which is why interpretations of the meeting often focus less on what she said and more on what she did not say. No dramatic objection reportedly came, no attempt to challenge direction, no visible dispute, only distance, a growing emotional distance between the language being used and what that language seemed to mean. Because sometimes people do not reach a limit through conflict. Sometimes they reach it through realization. The realization that loyalty does not always guarantee certainty, that sacrifice does not always preserve opportunity, that protecting children from pressure does not necessarily protect them from consequence. And according to interpretations that emerged afterward, that may have been the moment something shifted. Not anger, not rejection, something quieter. Acceptance that the conversation was no longer theoretical. Acceptance that motherhood had entered the room before anyone acknowledged it. Acceptance that she could remain loyal to the institution and still feel the weight of what it was becoming. And when that realization finally settled, staying seated may have become harder than standing up. Still, walking out didn't mean walking away. After the meeting ended, the conversations reportedly did not. If anything, according to interpretations that emerged afterward, that was when the real discussions began. Because private meetings inside institutions like the monarchy are rarely remembered for what is formally decided. They are remembered for what changes afterward. The pauses become longer. The language becomes more careful. Certain subjects appear less often. Others suddenly appear everywhere. And reports suggest this moment may have carried that exact feeling. No public announcement followed. No statement attempted to frame the discussion. No official clarification appeared to explain what had or had not changed. Yet according to royal commentary and insider interpretations, people inside the broader circle reportedly continued talking long after the room itself had emptied. Not loudly, quietly. The kind of conversations that begin with practical language and end somewhere much more personal. Interpretations suggest there were attempts to soften what had been discussed, to reposition it, to emphasize that nothing dramatic had occurred, that long-term planning was not the same as finality. That adaptation was not rejection. Perspective, according to some commentary, message, think long-term, avoid reacting emotionally, see the bigger picture. Phrases like these reportedly began circulating around the edges of the conversation, because institutions survive by convincing people that difficult choices are necessary. And monarchy, perhaps more than most institutions, survives by asking individuals to carry outcomes they did not create. According to interpretations afterward, senior figures may have attempted to redirect attention toward continuity rather than disappointment. The future of the institution, public expectations, stability across generations. The argument was familiar. The monarchy cannot organize itself around possibilities. It must organize itself around certainty. And viewed from that angle, narrowing visible roles could appear logical. But logic and emotion rarely arrive at the same destination, because while conversations reportedly emphasize structure, another reality quietly remained in the room. Families do not experience institutional decisions institutionally. They experience them personally. That tension between preserving the crown and protecting the people inside it reportedly became harder to ignore after Sophie left. Commentators later pointed toward something subtle. Her absence became noticeable. Not dramatic, not symbolic, just noticeable. People reportedly expected her to return, expected another conversation, expected clarification. And when that did not immediately happen, interpretations began multiplying. Some believe she simply needed distance. Others interpreted the exit as exhaustion rather than disagreement. A few suggested something more difficult, that perhaps she had already understood the direction of travel before everyone else was ready to admit it. That possibility created its own kind of unease. Because if someone known for patience and restraint reached a moment of withdrawal, what exactly had changed? Reports suggest no answers came, only quieter observations. Conversat, ions becoming more cautious, language becoming less certain, people speaking less about future opportunity and more about future realities. And gradually, interpretations reportedly spread beyond the immediate circle. Not accusations, questions. Questions that moved carefully from conversation to conversation. Was this still about modernization? Was it becoming something broader? How many future roles would truly remain? What happens to those raised close to service but never fully invited into it? And perhaps the question that lingered longest of all: when institutions evolve, who decides which sacrifices count? Because by then, according to interpretations surrounding the meeting, something unexpected had happened. The conversation was no longer about Sophie. It was no longer even about her children. It had become a larger question about what the monarchy asks from families and what it gives back. And once questions like that begin moving quietly through private rooms, they rarely start. Are you there for a long time? And outside palace walls, people began asking difficult questions. To the public, royal children often symbolize continuity. Inside the institution, they can represent something far more complicated. By the time questions reportedly began drifting beyond palace circles, the story had already changed shape. What started as interpretations of one private meeting gradually became something broader, a conversation about expectation, inheritance, and what modern royal life is quietly becoming. Because once people moved beyond the immediate emotion of Sophie's reported departure, attention turned towards something deeper. What exactly had changed? For generations, the public relationship with royal children has followed a familiar pattern. They are introduced as symbols before they become individuals. They represent the future before they understand what that future asks of them. Their existence often carries an assumption of continuity, as though every generation naturally When Princess Anne emerged, steps forward to inherit not only identity but responsibility. But according to royal commentary over recent years, that assumption may no longer feel automatic. The monarchy many people imagine, and the monarchy attempting to exist today, may not always be the same institution. Reports and interpretations have increasingly described a growing pressure inside royal structures to appear focused, efficient, and clearly defined. Public expectations have evolved. Questions surrounding relevance, cost, visibility, and purpose have become more persistent, and institutions rarely ignore questions they believe will shape their survival, which means adaptation becomes difficult to avoid. But adaptation has consequences, because when an institution becomes smaller, someone inevitably finds themselves standing outside the new boundary. That realization reportedly changed how many observers interpreted Sophie's position, not as frustration, not as disappointment, but as something more human. For yesterday, the public had often viewed her family as occupying a uniquely balanced position, close enough to preserve connection, distant enough to preserve freedom. To many, that seemed ideal. Yet interpretations following the meeting introduced a more uncomfortable possibility. What if distance protects independence, but slowly reduces belonging? That question resonated because history offers complicated examples. Royal generations have rarely inherited identical realities. Expectations shift, roles narrow, visibility changes. Some inherit responsibility immediately. Others inherit symbolism with fewer defined paths attached to it. And while those transitions are often explained through institutional language, they can feel profoundly personal inside families. Because identity becomes difficult to define when titles remain but purpose becomes uncertain. According to commentators, this may be why sympathy quietly began building around Sophie, not because people believed promises had been broken, but because they recognized something familiar in her position. The tension between preparing children for freedom and wondering whether freedom arrived because opportunities disappeared. The tension between protecting normality and fearing normality might become permanent. And underneath all of that sat an even larger question that people increasingly seemed willing to ask. What does service actually mean now? Does service require public visibility? Does belonging require official responsibility? Can someone remain fully royal without becoming fully active? Those questions reportedly began appearing more often not as criticism, but as reflection. Because if the institution values restraint, privacy, and balance, what message does it send when those very choices appear to lead away from participation? Suddenly, what happened inside that meeting no longer felt isolated. It became symbolic, not of conflict, of transition. And according to interpretations that continued circulating after, one final exchange reportedly brought all of those tensions into focus. Because sometimes institutions reveal themselves not through announcements but through a single conversation no one expected to matter. But one final conversation reportedly changed everything. Reports and interpretations differ on details, but many converge on one idea. Sophie ultimately faced a choice between acceptance and resistance. By the time that final conversation reportedly happened, the atmosphere surrounding the entire situation had already changed. What began as questions about future roles no longer seemed to be about positions, visibility, or royal structure alone. Those issues still existed, but according to interpretations that continued emerging afterward, they had gradually become symbols for something much deeper. Choice. Not the institution's choice. A mother's. Because there comes a point in certain conversations where practical language stops carrying emotional distance. Numbers stop neutral. Policies stop feeling abstract. And people begin hearing not what is being said, but what it means. According to various interpretations of events, this final exchange did not reportedly arrive with confrontation. No dramatic declarations. No ultimatums. No obvious fracture. Instead, it may have arrived through a quieter realization that protecting children and preparing children are not always the same thing. For years, there appeared to be an assumption that these goals could exist together, offer normality while preserving possibility, encourage independence while keeping the institution close enough to remain part of the future. But interpretations surrounding the meeting suggested something difficult had become impossible to ignore. What if waiting for choice eventually becomes the choice itself? That question reportedly reframed everything. Because once the conversation moved beyond titles, entirely different questions emerged. If public roles become narrower, is that automatically diminish identity? If children grow outside formal structures, does that mean they lose connection or gain freedom? And perhaps most importantly, who benefits when continuity becomes smaller? Reports and commentary suggest that somewhere within those reflections, Sophie's perspective may have started changing. Not suddenly, quietly. The possibility that had once felt painful may have begun to look different. Because preserving a future inside the institution had always been one version of protection. But preserving the ability to live outside it might be another. That realization does not remove emotion. It changes its direction. Commentators who reflected on the broader meaning of the moment often returned to one recurring idea. Maybe the hardest transitions inside royal life are not the public ones. They are the private decisions no one applauds. The moments when continuity asks families to adapt. The moments when people realize that loyalty is not measured only by proximity. And according to interpretations surrounding this period, acceptance reportedly began appearing not as surrender, but as reconciliation. Not agreement with every outcome, not celebration, just recognition. Recognition that institutional continuity and personal fulfillment may no longer follow identical paths. Recognition that children do not become less connected simply because their futures look different. Recognition that stepping back is not always losing ground. For someone long associated with service and restraint, perhaps that understanding carried its own form of strength, because if the purpose had always been to give her children the freedom to choose, then protecting that freedom could not suddenly become painful, simply because the choices changed. And slowly, the meaning of the moment reportedly shifted. The meeting stopped representing disappointment. The walkout stopped representing rejection. The future stopped representing absence. Instead, interpretation. Monarchy increasingly framed it as something more unexpected, a redefinition, not of what her children could become inside the monarchy, but of what they might become beyond needing it. And once that possibility entered the conversation, legacy itself began to look different, not smaller, just less dependent on visibility, which meant the real decision may never have been between duty and family at all. It may simply have been choosing which version of duty mattered most. And in the end, the story became larger than one meeting. The walkout may never be officially explained, but for many observers it symbolized something timeless. Even inside monarchy, some of the hardest decisions are still made as parents. By the end of it all, according to interpretations and commentary that continued circulating afterward, the meaning of that moment no longer seemed attached to one meeting, one proposal, or one unanswered question. What remained was something quieter, something more lasting. Perspective. Because institutions change. They always have. Every generation of monarchy eventually reaches a point where old assumptions stop fitting new realities. Roles shrink, expectations shift, traditions that once felt permanent begin adapting to pressures no previous generation had to navigate. Public life becomes louder, private life becomes harder to protect, and somewhere in that constant adjustment, families are asked to carry decisions history later describes as inevitable. But living through them never feels inevitable. That may be why so many interpretations of Sophie's reported response eventually moved away from disappointment and toward reflection. For years, she had often been viewed as representing continuity in its gentlest form, duty without spectacle, stability without performance, presence without demand. Yet perhaps the deeper lesson was never about remaining unchanged. Perhaps it was about knowing when change no longer threatens identity. Because according to many observe, what emerged from this period was not a retreat from royal life. It was a different understanding of it, one that separates belonging from visibility, one that accepts that influence may not always appear in official roles, one that recognizes that raising children with freedom can still honor tradition. That idea may feel unfamiliar to people who imagine monarchy as a fixed path handed from one generation to the next, but history rarely works that neatly. Every generation redefines what service means. Some serve publicly, some preserve privately, some protect institutions, others protect the people expected to inherit them. And according to interpretations surrounding this story, Sophie's position reportedly began to reflect that quieter version of strength, not resistance, not withdrawal, choice. The choice to allow identity to exist beyond expectation. The choice to let children define themselves before being defined by structures around them. The choice to trust that meaning do not disappear simply because visibility changes. Commentators increasingly suggested that perhaps this was never a story about losing a future. It was a story about refusing to reduce the future to one version of success. Because when roles become uncertain, values become clearer. And if those values remain intact, service, dignity, family, responsibility, then maybe the shape of the journey matters less than people once believed. The institution, according to many interpretations, will continue evolving. New expectations will emerge. Future generations will face questions different from the ones before them. But the families inside those walls will continue facing something timeless. How much should be given? How much should be protected? And when those answers conflict, which one deserves to win? Perhaps that is why the reported walkout stayed with so many people. Not because someone left a room, but because people imagined what it means to sit in that room and realize your role is not longer only to serve history. It is also to protect the people who come after you. And maybe that is the part of monarchy that never changes. Titles evolve, structures adapt, expectations rise and fall, but parents still measure success differently. Not by what their children inherit, by what their children are free to become. Because sometimes the most royal act isn't claiming a place in history, it's choosing who gets to live beyond it. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.